the case of Sindell and Abbott Laboratories. I believe this case is significant. It is an example of a civil lawsuit. It's a tort law claim, specifically a product liability claim. It was a landmark decision, still is a landmark decision. It introduced uh, the idea of market share liability, which is an expanded version of alternative liability. Alternative liability states that when it's impossible to determine the causation of injury sustained from multiple defendants' actions, the burden of proof then shifts to the defendants to prove that they were not the cause. There are a few requirements in order to apply this alternative liability. The defendants' much actions are equally tortuous and substantially simultaneous, which means that essentially the defendant's actions are equal in the risk that they cause to injury for the plaintiff or the person who got hurt. Um, if the defendant cannot prove that they were not the cause, they may be held jointly and severely liable, which means the plaintiff could collect um, judgment or collect, damages fully from any and all of the defendants named in the case. Market share liability, it sort of expands on the idea of alternative liability. And it basically means that companies may be held liable for damages equivalent to their market share of the harmful product at the time it was consumed. Essentially, companies, their liability is dependent on the market possessed at the time, uh, you know, the the defective product was produced. There are again requirements to applying this market share liability. The first is the plaintiff, through no fault of their own, cannot identify which defendant produced the defective product. The defective product is also completely fungible, which means that it is interchangeable among all the other manufactured products from the different companies at the time. Um, and all the named defendants are potential tortfeasors and combined make up a substantial share of manufacturers of the product during the relevant time period. Um, these restrictions will become important later on, and I will explain them as we go further in the presentation. Sindell and Abbott Laboratories was finally decided in the Supreme Court of California. It was brought March 20th. It's brought to the Supreme Court in March 20th of 1980. The defendants initially demurred the complaint, and the trial court found in favor of the defendants based on the fact that the plaintiffs were unable to uh, to definitively prove causation. They were unable to prove that the defendants named in the case caused the actual injury. The plaintiffs in this case is Judith Sindell and Maureen Rogers, um, and it's a class action. During the case was appealed to the Supreme Court, which is why they are plaintiffs and appellants. And during the appeal, Judith Sindell's and Maureen Rogers' cases were combined um, because they're basically similar circumstances. And it is also a class action suit. So they also represent a class of similarly situated women. Um, and the defendants are Abbott Laboratories, Eli Lilly and Company, ER Squab and Sons, the Upjohn Company, Relaxol Drug Company, and six other drug companies which manufactured DES, which is the defective drug in question in this case. The complaint is essentially the plaintiffs claim that they developed cancer as a result of their mothers taking diethyllistrol shorter name is DES, during pregnancy due to the various factors, including time that had passed. The plaintiffs were unable to identify the exact manufacturer of the DES taken by their mothers. Um, Again, this will become a little bit more important as we go on. The claim also alleges that the defendants and the industry as a whole failed to properly test, warn, and label the drug as experimental, thereby acting in concert to cause injury to the plaintiffs. Um, Sindell originally asked for compensatory damages of $1 million and punitive damages of $10 million. She is also asking for equitable relief um, for the class that she represents. She would like there to be tests at free clinics in California to test for the presence of disease, along with uh, warning by the manufacturers to the public and to practitioners or doctors. And it seems like Maureen Rogers is asking for about the same amount of damages. There is a slight distinguishment between Maureen Rogers and Judah Sindell's case, and that Maureen Rogers, you know, changed. She originally named three defendants. She had changed her case to name just one defendant, Eli Lilly and Company, at the time of this case. So it's kind of dependent. If Maureen Rogers is unable to prove causation of Eli Lilly, the ruling would also stand for Maureen Rogers. Okay, so a little background. Between 1941 and 1971, approximately 200 companies had manufactured the DES drugs, which is a synthetic compound of estrogen. In 1947, the FDA authorized the marketing of DES as a miscarriage preventative um, on an experimental basis. The drug was produced from an identical formula, meaning that each of the manufacturer's products were interchangeable with one another. It was completely fungible. This is a common practice in the pharmaceutical company or companies, the manufacturers of pharmaceuticals. DES was subsequently linked to the development of cancer. This type of cancer is uh, adenocarcinoma, and it develops in the daughters who were exposed to the drug prior to their birth. Um, it has a it has a long latency period. It a minimum of about 10 to 12 years after exposure, the cancer starts to manifest itself. Uh, Prior During this manifestation, sufferers the majority of sufferers from this cancer develop adenosis, which is it's precancerous growths in the vaginal and cervical uh, areas. And this is normally a precursor to the development of this specific type of cancer caused by DES, which is a form of adenocarcinomonia. Adenocarcinomonia. Sorry. In 1971, the FDA withdrew its authorization for the drug due to the risk to the unborn child. It also ordered manufacturers to cease marketing and promoting DES as as a miscarriage preventative and to warn physicians and the public of the risk of the drug. Between 1947 and 1971 is a estimated approximately 1.5 to 3 million pregnant women took DES. The specific facts about this case, DES was prescribed to the mothers of Sindell, Rogers, and of the class they represent, for the purpose of preventing miscarriages while the plaintiffs were in utero. As a result, the plaintiffs had developed cancer or the precancerous growths. Um, uh, due to the prenatal exposure. Due to various factors, the plaintiffs were unable to exactly name the manufacturer of the DES that their mothers ingested. This was due to a few factors, primarily time. It's a long latency period, again, 10 to 12 years, and the plaintiffs weren't even born at the time of exposure. Um, you know, records weren't really kept that long. And also, how the prescription is fulfilled, doctors prescribe generic, the generic name of the drug. A pharmacist fills the prescription based on kind of what is available. At no point is it clear to the patient what brand of drug they're, or at least it's not not uh, not easily clear to what brand of drug or what manufacturer the drug was coming from. Um, and again, due to the long latency period, there's a lack of records, um, and it's also not customary for manufacturers to track the patients who are prescribed their drugs. So the manufacturers also do not uh, keep these records, nor do they track uh, this data. Um, the defendants named in this case produced approximately 90% of the DES marketed at the time. So, uh, you know, quite a lot of the drug manufactured at the time did come from the defendants named in this case. So the case outcomes. The court had found that the plaintiff's allegations of consorted action to be unfounded. Basically, the preceding cases cited by the plaintiff, um, Summers v. Tice, Oser v. George, and Hall v. E.I. DuPont, mainly were the cases cited. They are cases that are examples of alternative liability. However, in each of these cases, the defendants make up the entire uh, the entire tortfeasors, the entire parties that could have caused the injury were represented uh, in the lawsuit. This is not true of the case, as there were 200 manufacturers of the drug at the time, and some of the manufacturers were out of business at the time this lawsuit came. It was impossible to join all of the defendants together uh, in a way that would uh, that would merit uh, using these cases cited by the plaintiff, um, as they are currently interpreted. I guess would be the right way of saying that. Um, the court also, in denying the allegations of uh, concert of action, the court also was um, explicit in saying that in Hall v. E.I. DuPont, they relied on an industry standard kind of set forth by the industry. In this case, the industry standard is, uh, you know, the government is highly involved in the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. Therefore, like the standard is influenced heavily by the FDA, and the FDA is the one who is making suggestions, to testing and warning labels and things along those lines. So they found it that in this case, the defendants, following um, the FDA's suggestions didn't warrant a concert of action liability claim. Um, the courts did, however, reason that a modification of the Summers trial doctrine was necessary given the unique situation of this case. And this case was uh, unique in a way that the defective product was completely fungible, meaning that any of the manufacturers could have produced the same amount of risk to the plaintiff, based on the fact that the formula for the pill were, eh, a constant. Um, in the case of Summers v. Tice, it had to do with uh, a hunting accident in which two hunters shot in the direction of the plaintiff, well, injured the plaintiff, but shot at the same time, causing injury to the plaintiff. Um, it was negligence. It wasn't on purpose, but yeah. So, but they were unable to figure out which gun produced the injury or who, um, you know, uh, how the injury was afflicted. It wasn't clear who fired the injuring shot. In that case, both the hunters were held liable. So fungibility does play a lot in sort of applying Summers to this case. The the defendants represented a substantial percentage of the market at the time. Again, 90% of the DES drug manufactured at the time came from these named defendants. Um, again, the court sort of wrestled with this in that the prior president, in prior preceding cases using alternative liability, the defendants made up the entire tortfeasors. And in this case, it's a majority of the possible tortfeasors, or the entire possible tortfeasors, I guess. Um, uh, but mainly the court reasoned that these plaintiffs, if held to the same standard of the prior president precedent, they really had no foreseeable avenue for relief, uh, given the conventional interpretation. Um, it was impossible to join all of the tortfeasors in one case, and it was also um, really impossible to prove causation from one manufacturer over another, essentially in these cases. In this case. Um, So the court decided to establish a new doctrine, which is the market share liability. Uh, they believe that this was an equitable solution for all the parties involved. It was not only, it gave uh, an avenue for relief for these plaintiffs, but it also did not un well, in their opinion, it did not unfairly uh, punish the defendants either, in that it was, again, they reasoned that it was um, reasonable based on their market share, uh, that the damages would be divvied up among the defendants based on their market share at the time. And the court was worried if they had used a sort of the jointly and severely liable uh, judgment, that it could cause the actual tortfeasor to not be punished, as the entire uh, tortfeasors were not named in the case. So they reason that this, is at least a way of having uh, the manufacturer sort of be liable for their possible risk to Sindell and plaintiffs in her same. class. So my key learnings from this was mainly that it shows the court's willfulness to not only reinterpret past precedent, but to also augment it, which is which doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. And you know, I guess this would be more on the lines of court activism is always controversial, and this ruling is no different. This is definitely a court, uh, you know, sort of imposing its rule beyond the sort of uh, prior precedent, um, and a little bit beyond of what was argued by the plaintiff as well. Uh, and I get the controversy in this ruling, but I do think that the court was thoughtful in its approach, at least in this case, uh, and in in that of the group, the injured parties really did not have an avenue to relief, and the court was very explicit in the restrictions it imposed. And I believe this actually uh, helped with the reducing the overutilization of the market share liability doctrine. Uh, the dissent was very concerned about overutilization, and you know, but in truth, because of the restrictions, only a very small handful of cases have been decided, and only a very small, and therefore a very small handful of damages have been rewarded based on the market share liability doctrine. And when I originally read this, I thought uh, the same thing as the dissent. I thought that there would be a lot of cases that would have uh, tried to argue tried to argue and also been found for the plaintiffs based on market share liability. What first came to mind for me was asbestos, since asbestos, the latency in which the effects of asbestos were extremely long, and therefore it would have created a ambiguity to which manufactured the injuring product. But due to the restrictions, again, the restrictions are essentially, and I think the most restricting restriction, if that makes any sense, is the fungibility. So asbestos, uh, as I was researching, asbestos is actually not that fungible. An asbestos tile made by one company contains vastly different amounts of asbestos than the same tile made by another company. They are not essentially interchangeable. They do provide different amount of risk. The only asbestos case that was actually decided in favor of the plaintiff, uh, in which market share liability was used, was Wheeler versus Ray Bestos in Manhattan, and this was having to do with asbestos brake pads, in that the brake pads uh, were essentially interchangeable parts. A company developed brake pads that used asbestos, and it has created the brake pads themselves were interchangeable. This was a case brought on by mechanics who were changing the brake pads, who developed lung cancer as a result of being exposed to this asbestos. The brake dust caused from coming off the brake pads. So, uh, but again, one case out of many for asbestos uh, was charged, and the same's true. It's because the because the ruling was so controversial, and also because of the restrictions placed on the imposed by the court. Um, market share liability has been very, uh, I don't know if underutilized, but rarely utilized uh, uh, up to date. It is uh, seems more of a high standard to utilization uh, than a high standard to um, to the burden of proof put on the defendants, as argued in the dissent. So, I thought this was a very interesting case. I did enjoy reading about it, and again, in doing research on it, it actually, it, it actually sort of changed my mind and how I thought about the market share liability introduced in this case. Thank you very much. This has been my presentation, and I hope you have a great day.